former minister, and founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Franson, is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Tonight's episode, Muslim Reformers versus Fundamentalists, with Eric Brazau.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Wade Franson. I am your host of Created in the Image of God, the Role of Religion in Society. We have a very special program tonight, a new guest. We haven't seen him before. Some of you may have seen the sneak peek in which we introduced Eric Brazau. Eric specializes in helping people accept the reality of Islam's contribution to Western civilization. What is this reality? Eric's particular take on this is that the reality of Islam in the West is what Muslim leaders in the West say the reality of Islam is. His book, Muslim Reformers versus Fundamentalists, tells us clearly what 97% of mainstream Muslim leaders tell us that Islam is. Let's go ahead and welcome Eric into the studio. Good evening, Eric.
Good evening, Wade, and good to be here.
You're coming to us from a little bit north of me, right up in the frozen white wasteland known as Canada?
Toronto, yes.
And how's the spring doing there? Do you have something called breakup? We used to have something called breakup up in Alaska in the spring when all the permafrost and ice started to thaw a little bit.
Not so much here, and we haven't had much ice to thaw because it's been a very mild winter.
Well, good. Well, very excited to have you in the studio. You and I have had several conversations about your particular perspective. It's somewhat nuanced, and we look forward to unpacking that fully and completely. But as we usually do here on the Created in the Image of God show, we like to unpack your personal creation story, right? So where do you come from? What were your parents like? Where did they come from? Where were you born? Have you always been in Toronto? Tell us a little bit about those early formative experiences.
I'll try to put that in a little bit of what we call a nutshell. So I was born in 1964 in Montreal. My parents are Polish. My father was Lithuanian. I grew up going to church for all the holidays. I did my first communion in a Catholic Polish church.
So were you at all aware, or your parents, and you may not have known, but of the distinction between Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism?
No, not at all. I just went to church and did my first communion.
Yeah.
And I went to church and did my communion in the Polish language.
Wow.
And then I
actually learned a little bit of Polish years ago, but I would say to our Polish friends in the audience, ja nie rozumiem po polsku.
God, you do not understand Polish.
That's right.
Yes.
I did speak. I always pick up languages wherever I go, and I was actually doing some really interesting things in Poland. This isn't about me, so I won't go there, but and I have a really good accent and ability to pick up languages quickly. So I'll throw out my few phrases and people will get excited and start, hammering me with the language, whatever it is. And I used to be able to do this in about 20 different languages. And I'd be like, whoa. And that's where I had to say, ja nie rozumiem po polsku.
So you know enough just to let people think you know how to speak the language.
Yes, exactly. A wise fool. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so did those early religious experiences shape you in any way? And I know it's kind of hard to go back sometimes and really, evaluate.
I would have to say not so much, except that when I was about 11 or 12, I remember thinking to myself, how come all of these people are coming to church and they're dressing so fancy? Because in my mind, church was supposed to be a humble kind of a place. And I was like 10, 12, and I'm noticing everyone's wearing their fur coats and being very fancy. And I also noticed that after church, of course, we had like a gathering in the church hall where people drink coffee, such. And I noticed there was a lot of gossip.
Right.
People talking. And that's the thing that stuck with me as a child. I always remembered that part, the gossip, everyone gossiping.
Yeah.
And I remember doing my first communion, learning that gossiping and talking about people was supposed to
It's a
be bad.
mortal sin, right?
And here we are, people are doing it. So that's
Well,
my
for our Baha'i friends, and people know, I think, that I'm a Baha'i. Backbiting, which gossip is not necessarily always backbiting, but generally speaking, it usually is. Backbiting is the worst sin
yes.
in according to Baha'i faith because it spreads disunity.
It's the same thing in Christianity. It's basically you're murdering somebody's reputation, their
Yep.
personality.
Yep.
Yes. So
Well,
that's with the Christian religion. And then I came to Toronto in 19 just after 2011. Sorry, 2001, 9/11. And
wow, interesting timing.
yes.
Speaking of 9/11, and we'll get more into the Muslim aspect, but sort of the clash of civilizations. I would ask one more question about that early upbringing. When you mentioned Poland and Lithuania, um, you know, I was in Poland in 1985, before the wall came down, and so did that sort of clash of civilizations. And right now I'm watching a really interesting Netflix series on the atomic bomb and how that played out during the Cold War and whatnot. And so did your heritage of Polish Lithuanian play into how your worldview at all? Were you aware of the Cold War that you grew up in and its implications, communism versus capitalism and the global
Not
domino theory and all that stuff?
not any more than anyone else. I was just a kid growing up in
Hmm.
Montreal and did all the regular things, and just we went to church from time to time, did my
Hmm.
first communion, and that was my connection to religion. Nothing more than that. The only thing is that at one point I spent time and I read the New Testament and I studied the Bible, etc., for a few years, and I just had difficulty accepting a virgin birth, the miracle of the virgin birth.
Hmm.
And for me, Christianity ended up being more figurative than literal.
Hmm.
So I thought the more I read about Christianity and the life of Jesus, I thought, well, whether this is figurative or literal, it seems like a pretty good way to structure humanity.
Hmm.
Simple.
Yep. Interesting. So you began to look at it more as moral, spiritual guidance, a lot of metaphors,
Yeah.
Jesus himself speaking in parables, for example,
Yes.
and so on. Interesting. Well, so did 9/11 and the timing of that arrival in Toronto, did that play in at all into your interest in Islam? When
Well,
did you begin to get an interest in looking at Islam and its impact on Western civilization?
so when 9/11 happened, to some extent, just to be a contrarian, because I tend to be a contrarian, that's my nature. And when 9/11 happened, I was on the other side of the debate. I was saying, well, America is everywhere, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Why is it such a tragedy? Many things happened everywhere else.
Yep, they have their reasons. Did you go that far at that time?
Not so much. No, I just
Yep.
was the whole idea. And I was just being contrarian to be
Right.
contrarian to some
Right.
extent.
Hmm.
And
Well, let's pause there. I want to go. This is why I like doing this segment. Um, how far back can you go in your analysis of you being contrarian? Because, you know, being contrarian often gets sort of, beat out of people, not necessarily literally, or, peer pressured out of people. You are taught to go along and conform. And where did that contrarian impulse come
when
from, and why
when
did it
when
stick
when
with you
I
so long?
when I was 14 years old, me and a buddy of mine, we looked at we said, we're athletes, we like to do sports, so we're not going to smoke cigarettes,
Hmm.
even though everyone around us was smoking cigarettes.
Good
And
move.
I remember at school, somebody said, can I have a cigarette? And I said, well, I don't smoke. He said, yeah, but I thought you would carry cigarettes just to hand them out to people. And I'm like, what? That's weird, right? Like, so I was always outside, only simply because as a small child, I saw what was going on in the church with the backbiting,
Hmm.
and I saw the hypocrisy.
Interesting.
So
So,
because
so
I was always aware of hypocrisy, it
yeah,
made me an independent thinker.
Well, I love that. I mean, to me, um, I've spent many episodes talking about hypocrisy, not the whole episode, but I bring it up often in that, to me, hypocrisy, there's a scientific way to try to look at hypocrisy, or at least certainly a very logical way. And that is, hypocrisy by definition is either the holding of a double standard, or which is, and a double standard is either treating two things that are different as though they're the same, or treating two things that are the same as though they are different. So that's a way to analyze, am I being a hypocrite? Are these two things the same, or are they not? Or is the aspect that I'm judging the same, or is it not? Right?
But but Wade, I think you're going too far. Most people are hypocrites because they just don't realize they're hypocrites. They're just not thinking well.
I could not agree with you more, which is why I formulated this approach to try to, in a more detached way, without using that word hypocrite, right?
Right.
Because they're not intentionally hypocrites usually. And I've said this so many times based on my travels and speaking different languages. Pretty much everybody on the planet believes they're right, and they're convinced of the goodness of their rightness, right?
And they're convinced of that they're reasonable people.
Right. And so how do you unpack that for them as well? Well, look, these two things are really different, and you're looking at them as though they're the same. Or these two things are the same, and you're treating them as though they're different. So you don't have to use the word hypocrisy.
Well, that's why I wrote a book called Muslim Reformers versus Fundamentalists.
Right.
And that's exactly what I tackle, is how to bring forth all of this information and this knowledge in a manner that lays it out clearly for people to see what the reality is. If I can be so bold as to say, I think I've attained that objective, and that the book works on that level. So most people don't know why they believe what they believe. Whether I agree with them or not, that's not the point. The point is, most people will just say what they say, not really certain as to why they're saying what they're saying. They just prefer to believe that, for the most part. So people who could be right-wingers, or people that I would agree, or someone I agree with their opinion, might not understand why they have the opinion that they have.
Right.
I could disagree with their opinion, and they could also not understand why they believe and hold the opinion that they hold.
Right. And you can also yell at each other and call each other idiots, immoral, evil, and that may not be true at all. It just may be, ill-informed, misinformed, operating under, a flawed premise, whatever.
For the most part, that's what it is, and that's what I prefer to approach it as. And if it comes to the point where, on some level, the person is being obstinate just to be obstinate, or they're just disagreeing just to be disagreeable, then there's no purpose to continue the conversation.
Yep.
Or the debate, quote unquote.
Right.
Which I try to stay away from.
Right.
I don't debate.
Because the debate is trying to prove the other person wrong.
Correct.
That's usually counterproductive.
Correct.
Okay, great, awesome. So let's then talk back where we were before I derailed it into a more generalized view, Islam, and your interest in Islam, stemming from being contrarian, 9/11. Then what happened?
Well, then I was... Okay, so then we had not Charlie Hebdo, the Danish cartoons fiasco.
Yep.
At which point I said,
that was pre-Hebdo. Yep.
That was pre-Hebdo, yes.
Yeah.
So we had the Danish cartoons, and at that point I was studying and practicing Buddhism very intently. And so I was there was a community of us, obviously, and that community was subdivided into smaller communities, and we would meet at our leader's house every 2 weeks to study Buddhism. At which point we would have after cookies and coffee afterwards, to which I would say, well, we should all print these cartoons because, we need to stand up for freedom of speech, etc., etc. And everyone said, no, we have to respect the religion and we need to respect it. And I said, well, that could be a mistake. And then I ended up in a restaurant at one point, speaking with a bunch of or several cab drivers. It was 11:30 at night, and I made the joke and I said nobody actually wants Sharia law to come to Canada. To which they responded, "Yes, we do." To which I responded, "Ha ha! Of course you're making a joke." To which
What year was this approximately, to just contextualize it?
this would have been 2003 or four, and the
Okay.
reason I brought that up was because there was a possibility here in Ontario that there would be family law tribunals governed under the auspices of the imams. It would be called like a Sharia law tribunal.
Yep.
So for family matters, Muslim
Right.
families would go to the imam to give them a judgment. And so there was a lot of controversy, a lot of conversation around that topic.
As
And that's why,
there should be in a Western civilization, because the standards of judgment and equality are different. So it's not just a matter of family law and matters of like divorce,
well,
right? Where
the funny, interesting thing is that
yeah,
a woman who was assigned to do the inquiry or to check to see if it would be feasible under Dalton McGuinty, she came back and said, yes, it would be a good idea to give them to make these tribunals. And of course, the
interesting.
whole society was in an uproar, and a lot of Muslims themselves said, no, this would be a bad idea. And by the thinnest of margins, it did not pass. And that's what led me to realize when I was in that restaurant and these cabbies, all of whom had long beards, said, yes, we are Muslims, and all Muslims want to live by Sharia because Sharia is the will of Allah. At that point, I said, could it be possible that Muslims really want to turn Canada into an Islamic state? And I went off on a quest. And that was in 2000, I can't remember now, 2003, 2004. And as time went by, I got further and further into it. And after Hillary Clinton made the apology for Benghazi, I don't know if, remember the Benghazi affair?
Yep.
Some gentleman made a film called The Innocence of Muslims. And then there was that controversy.
Right. And that was, certainly by some deemed to have been debunked and misrepresentation of what actually was behind it. But be that as it may, it was similar issues that were being raised, right?
And so the issue was we should not offend the noble religion of Islam.
Right.
Actually, Clinton said that. At that point, I printed a flyer, gave it out, very offensive flyer, and went in downtown Toronto telling everyone in a very loud voice, this is my freedom of art, this is my freedom of expression. I am insulting the Prophet Muhammad, blah, blah, blah. Said some very derogatory things about Islam and the Prophet Muhammad. One thing led to another. Long story short, I went to jail for hate crimes against the religion of Islam.
Wow.
I was in jail for a total of 3 years in 5 years. And, I went in for 10 months, came out, probation, did something, went back in. So it was a saga. And then I realized not all Muslims and all Islam is the same. So I reevaluated my stance on Islam. And I am now someone who wants to eliminate the misunderstandings and misinformation surrounding Islam and Islamophobia here in Canada.
Well, I think that's a really good spot to take a quick commercial break and air the video that introduces your book, and mention to the audience, which are already beginning to comment here, which we always appreciate very much, that indeed you will be giving away a copy of your book to the person or persons whose comments you find interesting, insightful, humorous, whatever you like about them, and we will be looking at that. And there's I know there's one person in the audience who's up in Canada who has previously won books, and we've said, oh, it's really expensive to send them to Canada, and he said, well, then don't send them to me. But tonight, I'm not going to share with you who that is. He knows who he is. I know who it is. You're in Canada. Maybe this is a lucky night for that person. Anyway, don't go anywhere. We will be right back with Eric Brazau talking about the impact of Islam on Western civilization. Here is an ad for his book, which you can receive if you're active in the comments and the chat tonight.
Of the Muslim world, a profound dialogue unfolds. Who wins in a debate between Muslims, reformers, and fundamentalists? For a decade, Eric Brazau has immersed himself in this discourse. As the founder of a blog exploring the interplay of Islam and Western civilization, he's engaged with both viewpoints. Is true Islam defined by compassion? Or does the historical interpretation advocate for stricter measures? His new book offers wisdom into these divergent perspectives. Muslim Reformers versus Fundamentalists, by Eric Brazau. Buy now.
Welcome back. I'm here in the studio with the very same Eric Brazau who you just saw in that video. And there's a QR code for his book if you don't want to wait to receive a copy of it by engaging in the chat. You can go directly there and obtain it for yourself. So Eric, you spent time in jail for hate speech. Tell us about that experience, and were you being hateful?
At the time, I did not think so. And something I have to tell you is that when at some point, so I was convicted at that time for willful promotion of hate, and the AG was trying to get me to, they dropped the charge of incitement to commit genocide. They were considering that, but that one they dropped. And then after, if you remember the attacks in Paris, France, the nightclub, and there was like 500 people were shot.
Yes, and was this also Charlie Hebdo related?
No.
It was after.
No. This was it was in the 15th November 13, Friday.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I remember the incident. I just don't.
Right.
But anyway, go ahead.
No, that was not Charlie Hebdo. So that evening, I went to Dundas Square, screaming and yelling, arguing, debating, talking, sometimes loud, sometimes not so loud. Police came, arrested me, and charged me with at first causing a disturbance and screaming and yelling in public. And then later on, they laid hate crimes charges, to which I spent 10 months in jail. They refused to give me bail over and over again, 3 times. Then when I went to what's called the preliminary hearing, which is when, because I was going to go to the big court, they were going to charge me. It was like a 5 years jail time. That was my jeopardy. The judge who heard the preliminary hearing said, "It seems to me that there is no crime here and that the prosecutor is shoehorning Mr. Brazau into a crime." So the fact that I was even charged, there was a lot of controversy about that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, had I smashed a window and stole a loaf of bread, well, that's theft. We know that. Talking, speaking, giving out flyers, saying things, it's a gray area, to be sure. And I was, after 10 months, I was given bail. And the Crown said, so long story again short, I pled guilty to causing a disturbance. And I was sentenced to time served, which was 10 months in jail. So I've only actually been convicted of a hate crime the one time. The other time that they were going to convict me, they charged me with the hate crime. They dropped that to causing a disturbance, to which I pled guilty to get the whole, and anyways, it went away. And then there was another incident that happened, and I was attacked by a mob at an event to which where I was holding a sign. And when I was attacked, the only people who came to my defense was the National Council of Canadian Muslims, who tweeted out, at the time was tweet, not an X. They tweeted, "There is no place for violence, for free speech, and we abhor violence, and everyone should have a right to speak." Something to that effect. At which point I said, okay, maybe I was wrong about Islam, and I'll go back and I'll revisit the whole thing starting from scratch. So I went right back to ground zero. I released a statement on YouTube, on Facebook, very publicly, denouncing my past, saying I regret the past, I'm moving forward in a new direction, and from now on, I will explore the authentic and true diverse Islam as dictated by Canadian authentic Islamic sources and imams. And that's what I've been doing now. It's hard to say. Is it 7 years or 8 years? From that,
So,
right.
so this is, I don't mean this the way it's going to come across because it's going to evoke certain memories. But if I say, so how's that working out for you? I just say
No,
that somewhat humorously in that I'm very intrigued by this story. This is fascinating for many reasons, not only the subject matter and the issues
mhm,
of justice, the issues of hypocrisy, but your own journey of exploration, awareness, self-discovery, in that your own beliefs. You've described how you so I love the analogy of sailing, right? I want to get to the other side,
mhm,
flowing towards me. I have to tack left and right and left and right and left
mhm, mhm,
make any progress. And I've said elsewhere that, society lurches forward from ditch to ditch, which is a negative way of saying that,
mhm.
right? But as you drive into the headwinds, and I've got to go back to a comment here. We normally don't necessarily show these comments at this stage, but I love this comment. All knowledge of individuals. This is from Lord Call. I always got to put my glasses on here because I always wonder if that's an O or an L. Lord Cole, which is cabbage in German, by the way. So he's the Lord Cabbage, as far as the Germans go. All knowledge of individuals, if investigated, ultimately rests on assumptions. This is a necessary aspect of human knowledge since we do not know anything directly. We've also had philosopher Joe Atman on the show who talks about this from the Garden of Eden perspective and unpacks how our concepts are what separates us from God. They are false idols in our mind, the constructs that we build around how we understand reality. So this is a more complex philosophical way of explaining the truth that, hey, we have to tack into the wind to understand anything. And as you have waded into this complex situation, pun on my own name intended, um, you have learned through experience of being put in jail and then later having the very people whom you were accused of hating come to your aid. And this goes way back to the 9/11 days where you've tacked into the wind of understanding Islam. So unpack that more for us. How's that working out for you? What are you learning? Where are you at today in your awareness and understanding?
Wow, okay. I can't unpack all of that. I can't even
No.
remember all of that. However, okay, so, wow. So, when NCCM said we support everyone's right to free speech, etc., I went
What is
back
NCCM?
and National Council of Canadian Muslims. They're a very
Okay.
large
Mhm.
Muslim, successful Muslim lobby group. Prior to being called NCCM, they were CARE Canada, as this associated to CARE US.
And that's an organization of Muslims as well that has been
Yes,
actually,
I'm indicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation's trial.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So I had a very negative. So when I saw that, I thought to myself, okay, what maybe I misread, or maybe there's a little bit of what we would call clever marketing or clever tweeting to put themselves on a better footing. So when I went back, I started to look at what NCCM, what CCI, which is Canadian Council of Imams, what is it that they're saying Islam really is? Forget about what Eric says Islam is, because who am I? I'm just some guy, right?
What does Eric know?
Well, what does Eric know? I don't speak Arabic. Nobody follows me. I'm just some guy who thinks he knows. So I said, forget all that. What do they know? Because what they say they know, they're the leading voices of Islam in Canada. So I started spending a lot of time there, and then I started looking at the individual imams who all have either Facebook pages, Twitter accounts, and they put up their sermons on YouTube for the mosque. What are they saying Islam is, and what are they preaching? Then I said, oh, that's very interesting. Interesting. But is that really what Islam is? So then I started to look at what Rahil Raza, Zudhi Jasser, Irshad Manji, Salim Mansour, who are what we would call Muslim reformers. What do they say Islam is? And what I noticed is that what the Muslim reformers tell us Islam is I prefer that type of Islam. It's more in conjunction with, they listen to music. It's all about live and let live. We cannot force people. We don't throw gays off buildings. And it's just amicable. It's like a nice, kinder, gentler Islam, which was in direct contrast with what National Council of Canadian Muslims, Canadian Council of Imams, ICNA Canada, and what vast majority of the Muslims who put up their sermons on YouTube were preaching. And because we go back and forth, there's a juxtaposition, like they're really contrary to each other. That's when I thought it's necessary for me to put together a book. And in this book, it's not what I say, it's what the two opposing voices say. What do they say Islam is? And ultimately, through my research, I was able to come to understand very clearly that the nicer, gentler, kinder Islam, the one that is LGBTQ friendly, is quite the minority. That's not anything to do with the mainstream Islam in any way, shape, or fashion. So I know which Islam I prefer. I'm pretty sure I know which Islam most people prefer. But just because we prefer something doesn't mean that that's what it will be or what it is. And so one of the things I live by when I talk about Islam, and I'm not sure if this is such a wisdom, but a Muslim is not Islam, and Islam is not the Muslim. And similarly, someone who says he's a communist is not the Communist Manifesto. He's just a person who believes what he believes. And the Communist Manifesto, or the doctrine of what we want to call communism, is apart from what any individual communist believes. Similarly to Islam. There's Islam and then there's Muslims, and the two are very separate. Similarly, if I were or was a Christian or am a Christian, that doesn't mean I am Christianity. I'm just a Christian who's trying to be a good Christian, whatever that means. So then it brings us back to when we hear Muslims and many imams saying, we want to be good Muslims. Well, what does being a good Muslim mean? Like, what do you have to do to manifest Islam in the proper way? And now when we say proper way, again, that's a minefield in itself. Proper is not based on what I think proper is or what we consider proper values. Proper is on what does the doctrine and 97% of the Islamic leadership say are the proper Islamic values. And again, the proper Islamic values have nothing to do with the Western idea of proper Western values. Very different from each other. And more and more, I'm understanding that at some point, it's not about right and wrong. It's just about which do we prefer. So is Western civilization better than, let's just call it Asian civilization? Well, it depends who you ask, right? So people who are like Asian civilization, those values, whatever that means, will say we prefer that as opposed to Western civilization. It doesn't mean that Western civilization is wrong or right. It just means they prefer not. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense, indeed. In business, they say you get what you measure, right? So whatever it is that is put forward, here in America, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Well, how do you define happy, right? What makes you happy? If there's a consensus among the people for certain things, then that might become a common denominator.
Correct.
But if there's not, then you have, we had a little bit of that in our house this morning when everyone was in a rush to get out of the house to school and work, and what people wanted at that particular moment was a little different, right? So
right.
We had a tense morning, and I'm not going to say Dad reacted the best as he should have there. So we may have a little happiness damage control to do. The point is, people get along until they don't, and then there are reasons why they're suddenly contending. So fascinating, your approach to this. I want to go quickly to another commercial break, and when we come back, in our initial meetings for the show, you shared with me a couple of things that certain imams were saying from within their mosques, and a couple of things that maybe we should just share with everybody and give that aspect as well. So when we come back, we'll dive into that. But right now, here is a word from one of our sponsors, the Royal Falcon Foundation. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Eric Brazau and the Muslim reformers versus fundamentalists.
Welcome to the Royal Falcon Foundation. Our curriculum and activities inspire and train adolescents through hands-on experiences, fostering growth and empowerment. Through immersive and challenging experiences, we shape young minds to think independently and develop their leadership skills. Our programs foster new friendships and unity, shaping young leaders to tackle real-world challenges with confidence. We believe in equipping the next generation with the skills to become leaders of tomorrow. Join us at the Royal Falcon Foundation and be part of a journey that empowers, unites, and inspires. Visit our website and embrace a world of possibilities today. RoyalFalconFoundation.com.
Welcome back to the Created in the Image of God show. I'm Wade Franson. We're here in the studio with Eric Brazau, author of Muslim Reformers versus Fundamentalists. Right before the break, we mentioned that you had shared a few quotes of things that various imams were saying. And because of your perspective that, look, we have to look at what the leaders say it is and, what a majority of Muslims believe it is in terms of understanding its impact on our society here in the West, Western civilization.
Sure, let's go right ahead.
Well, I don't remember what those comments were. I'm assuming you do.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, but before we go there, someplace that I would like to go, and I think
Sure.
it's very important, and you'll like it, is that the idea of who is an extremist. Often we use the term, or we hear the term being used, extremist Muslims. Have you ever heard that term?
Absolutely. And for the record, I've written a trilogy. First one of my in that series is called The People of the Sign, SIGN, in which I share a little bit of my background as a fundamentalist to a degree, not in the classic sense of fundamentalism as it's viewed and understood, but as somebody who tended to take the Bible literally. And people have said, you sound like a terrorist in this book. So I completely understand how people will become very strong-minded and opinionated about specific details in their religious beliefs. And
but if I may, wait, I have to interrupt you here.
Yep.
Where I'm going with that is not whether they are or not extremists and how they take their beliefs.
Well, right.
It's about people labeling them extremists.
Well, no, but that was my point. I did not consider myself extreme in the least. And they, you read that book, and I can certainly understand and accept why people would think that's absolutely extreme. But I wanted to lay it out. This is what our beliefs were. This is how we viewed things.
So, in the Hadith, apparently the Prophet Muhammad said very clearly that any pants that you wear below your ankles will bring you to hellfire, to hell. So you should not wear your pants below your ankles. Now, some would say that that's silly, and that to believe that you are an extremist. But
Shouldn't wear them below or above the ankles.
Below, no. They should only go until your ankles. Anything below your ankles means there's various reasons why, but you are now going to hellfire. So if a father tells his daughter at the age of 4 years old she needs to wear the hijab, and tells his son at the age of 6 years old that to die as a jihadist for the cause of Allah is a man's highest objective in life, would that be extremist, or would that just be mainstream real Islam? Again, who's to say it is or isn't, or what, who makes that call? Because if you talk to the imams and to that Muslim man himself, he'll say, I do not identify as an extremist. I self-identify as a Muslim. Correct?
Yep.
And I think it's against human rights to misidentify someone or to take away their preferred identity.
Right.
So I find it very annoying, and it bugs me out to a large degree when I keep hearing, well, he's an extremist and does not represent the true Islam. Well, how do you know? How does any pundit know? How did George Bush know when he said what he said? So I'm going to
let's just throw out a soundbite. Pick up your cross and follow me. That's maybe the highest honor of Christianity, right? And it evokes the similar feeling of, the highest honor is to become a martyr for Allah. To take up your cross and follow me. That cross is a symbol of martyrdom.
Sure. So then, and I didn't want to go there, and I hope we don't go there too deeply, is if we look at what are the fundamentals of what Jesus taught in terms of turning the cheek, the Beatitudes, the meek shall inherit the earth, blessed are the peacemakers, and all of that.
Well, I agree with you. I wanted to just establish that there are similar quotes in both books, but how the minister, the preacher, the priest, the imam is interpreting it, and what he tells you to believe and understand under that, right?
Well, it's not so much about interpreting it, because in Islam, the texts are very clear. There's a lot of the larger part of what Islam is and what people teach Islam to be is contained not necessarily in the Quran. It's all in the jurisprudence. It's in the Sharia law. It's in the Hadith. It's in the Sunnah.
Yep.
So when you're in the mosque and they're preaching, they don't just preach off the top of their head. They say, and the Quran tells us, and they recite the Quran, and they give you evidence as to why they believe and tell you what you need to do and believe. So Yasser Qadhi, who we have spoken about, who's a very major player in Islam, he said, and he went through the story. This is not a story to him, but he talks about how in 1979 the Kaaba in Saudi Arabia was hijacked. Do you remember that by any chance?
No. 79 to me is evokes the U.S. embassy in Iran.
Right. Okay. Well, prior to that, Juliman took him and about 200 people. They took the Kaaba hostage. There was a big fiasco. Some say 200, some say 500 people were shot and killed. There was a hostage situation for about 3 weeks because this Muslim student, who was a top student at the University of Medina, he thought that he was the Mahdi, like the savior of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
Yasser Qadhi said, there's a fine line between fanaticism and piousness, between a fanatic and a true believer. That's a very fine line. So in essence, what he was saying is that, and then he went on to explain that he wrote a paper on the whole incident on this man who took the Kaaba hostage. He went through all of his writings. He interviewed some of his teachers who were still alive. And everyone kept saying, this man was a top student. He was a great student. He was a true believer. However, he still did what he did. So it's very difficult for him he cannot separate and distinguish between a fanatic and a true believer. This is what Yasser Qadi said. So in essence, what is the difference between a true Muslim and a terrorist Muslim? Or is a true Muslim a freedom fighter Muslim for the cause of Allah? And why should we call him a terrorist? I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm saying that if someone tells his daughter at the age of 4 years old she must wear the hijab, and at the age of 12 years old she must now cover herself in the complete burqa, what is that? Is that extremism? If you forbid your son from listening to music and you pull him out of music class in school, is that extremism? You tell me. What's the line? When does someone go from being just a regular Muslim, quote unquote, whatever that means, to becoming a extremist Muslim? So in the United Kingdom, they classify a Muslim who wants to live by Sharia law as an extremist. Catherine Bullock, she's a Muslim scholar here in Canada, Toronto, Ontario. She was at Osgoode Hall, and she took umbrage with that the United Kingdom classifies all Muslims who want to live by Sharia law as extremists, because she says Muslims wanting to live under Sharia law is a perfectly normal point of view, because all Muslims want to live under Sharia law because that's the law of Allah. So how could that be extremism? Therefore, according to United Kingdom, the majority of Muslims are extremists because they want to live under Sharia law. Now, to live under Sharia law, what does that mean? Well, it means, to do away with what we would call secular law, Western law. Do I prefer to not live under Sharia law? I prefer not to. But Muslims prefer that they should. So who's prepared to say, and who has the authority to say that they are extremists? It's just what they want. It's what they feel is their duty to bring about. So Bilal Phillips, as well as many others, have said, and I have all of these clips, it is the duty of all Muslims to do whatever they can to bring about Sharia law and to implement the law of Allah. It is their duty. Simple. So obviously, and other imams have went on to say, we have to acknowledge that it's something we cannot do right now while we are a minority. It doesn't make sense because we are a minority. We have to be smart about it.
The minority would therefore impose their will upon the majority.
Well, but it's too small a minority. It's like we can't do it. It's not practical at this moment.
Right.
They've actually said that as clearly as I just spoke.
But if it were a majority, so let's spend a moment unpacking this. And I'm no expert, but I'm patting myself on the back a little bit about how much I do know and about this, more than I thought. Although I'm a novice and I know very little, but I do know that there are, some 50 nations that have a majority Muslim population.
Mm-hmm.
And of those, there are Muslim majority nations that have decided for whatever reason not to implement Sharia law in their state. Therefore, they are not considered Islamic states. But those nations that have in fact implemented Sharia law as the national law of the country, those are considered Islamic states. Now, here in the West, we think of Islamic State as being ISIS, right? And now that's one reason why some took exception, and President Obama here in the United States came up with a different name for ISIS because, no, it's not a legitimate Islamic state in the eyes of many Islamic states. But what people didn't realize is there are already many Islamic states around the planet, and those are those states that have implemented Sharia law. Is that accurate, basically, or am I getting that wrong?
I guess I wouldn't disagree with what you're saying, but from my perspective, it's to some extent maybe slightly irrelevant. Nothing turns on that.
Well, except what does turn on that is kind of a voting block at the United Nations. I don't necessarily want to go there.
We're talking about you're talking about the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It's 52 states, 52 votes at the United Nations.
Yeah.
Yes, but
because we're speaking now about a majority, right? And overall, the desire perhaps to transform the entire world into one which is submissive to Allah in the eyes and the interpretation of those who follow Islam.
Well, those who follow Islam will never say that it is not the duty of Muslims to instill Sharia law and the will of Allah over the planet. Now, who's going to do it? Who's going to sacrifice themselves to it? What is their dedication to it? That's another question.
Right.
But it is understood that Sharia law and the law of Allah must govern the planet. It must govern Canada. It must govern the United States. It must govern Germany. And however, what we must keep in mind, if we want to, that it's from the perspective of Islam, this is for the betterment of mankind.
Of course, because they're right and they are good. Every man is right and good in his own eyes.
But it will save us.
Right.
It will help us to become better people and a better nation.
Right.
When we adopt Sharia law or Islamic law.
Right.
Actually, I shouldn't say Sharia law because we're supposed to say it's just Sharia, the Sharia. It's like a redundancy to say Sharia law because Sharia is the law of Allah.
The Department of Redundancy Department.
Yes.
All right. Well, let us take another quick break there, and I'm going to play an ad for a book that is perhaps of great interest to some in the audience that doesn't address per se what is taught in Islam or other religions, but rather some of the underlying texts and looking at them from the outside and comparing them to one another. Not exactly comparative religion, but comparing certain interesting prophecies across multiple religions, Judaism, Christianity, the Baha'i faith, and Islam. So we'll be right back after this word from our sponsor, and we'll begin engaging with some of the audience. Don't go anywhere. This is the Created in the Image of God show. I'm here with Eric Brazau, sharing with us his view on the Muslim reformers versus fundamentalists. I always have to go look at that title. We'll be right back.
In a world where beliefs are tested and mysteries unfold, one book takes you on a journey of prophecy, faith, and the unexpected. Followers of William Miller held their breath as they awaited the prophesied second coming of Jesus in 1844. But when the advent didn't unfold as expected, the great disappointment swept across the land. However, what if the story didn't end there? What if the Spirit of Christ did return in 1844 in the Middle East? Dive into the prophecies of Daniel, where the past and present converge to reveal a hidden truth. Embark on a captivating journey where the threads of history and belief intertwine in ways you could never imagine. 1844, Convergence in Prophecy, a meticulously researched and documented exploration, unfolds like a mystery, captivating and engaging. A must-read for those who seek to understand our world's intricate tapestry of religions and their surprising unity. Are you ready to challenge your perceptions and uncover the hidden truths of our times? Embark on a journey that speaks to the heart of today's challenges and offers hope from the most unexpected source. 1844, convergence in prophecy. Dare to explore. Dare to believe.
And there's that QR code for those who'd like to know a little bit more about that book, but don't go anywhere. We're about to engage with the audience. So early on in the show, we were talking about people's perceptions, the ability to, be misled, misinterpret things because we're not engaging directly with reality. And Michael Zotz had this to say. 98% of mankind not really understanding the source of their beliefs. What do you say about that? You talked earlier about 97% of Canadian Muslims, for example, believing a certain way. And you had also mentioned that, humanity doesn't necessarily know even the source of their beliefs. How many of us need to take a deeper look, and how do we do that?
Okay, so to some extent, we might not need to know why we believe it's, because is there a reason why it's a good idea to say good morning and to all the people you meet in the morning, and to smile and to look up, and to be a part of civilization in your community? I don't need to know the reason why that's a good idea. We've just learned that that's kind of how society seems to work. So there are some things that we know and we learn because we just have through our parents and through our culture. Now, when it comes to things like multiculturalism, diversity, for example, or if we want to even use the other extreme, the whole idea of the whole gender fluidity and changing of sexes, a lot of people have some very powerful. Now, I'm going to say the people who want to change the status quo of the whole gender fluidity, etc., transgenderism, they have some very strong opinions on why it should be the way they say it should be. But if you'll notice, most of them, and I've had that conversation, that argument, or I should say that exploration, they don't want to go very far into examining why they believe that little girls and boys, removing their body parts is a very good idea. So people join tribes and groups. And once they're in that tribe or in that group, they no longer want to listen to anything that could bring them out of their group or out of that tribe. So again, we come back to the 98%. I'm not sure if it's 98%, but it's a lot of people who hold very strong opinions, don't know why they believe what they believe, but they believe it because the people that they like and the place that they prefer to be, that's the narrative that's held amongst that group of people. Now, if you remember, there was a time in our society when the idea of boys being boys and girls being girls was not questioned. It was not an issue to be discussed. Everyone just, if you said my son says that he's a boy and he wants
you don't really have to be that old to remember that time, though most people seem to have forgotten it rather quickly.
Correct. It wasn't that long ago. So to some extent, we have to say, what was the status quo for the last 2,000 or 5 or 10,000 years? We don't really need to explain it away. But those who want to dramatically change the status quo for something that's turned on its head, they bear the burden of proof. And the people who are making such very extravagant claims, such as society will be better if little boys remove their testicles, that's quite the claim. That's a very upside down statement.
Right.
Now,
And I think, to clarify, I think it would go, just for the sake of discussion, I think it would go more like where we would encourage those little boys to explore the idea that they could and should. Right.
Well,
I mean, either way, I feel the same way about it, but yes.
I remember making the joke. Imagine asking all the little boys and girls, are you sure you're not really a pyromaniac who wants to set fires? Think about that. Maybe you really are a pyromaniac. Here's some matches. Go away and play with them.
That's so funny because I have a shirt that somebody gave me that says something like resident pyromaniac. And because when I was a little boy, at one point I discovered, hopefully no kids are listening here, that you could take an Amway bottle, fill it with turpentine, and you could have a candle and you could turn it into a flamethrower. Extremely dangerous.
Sure, and so we don't encourage children.
But I did that because
Right.
yes, I guess had I known what the word meant, I would have identified as a pyromaniac at that time.
Right, but we don't encourage children to explore their pyromaniacness because it's just.
I literally did set a field on fire, and the fire department had to come. Thankfully,
Sure.
it didn't get any worse than that. But
But the point is, for the last 5,000 years, we've functioned as a society because of. So, to some extent, for the last, I don't know how many years, but Western civilization is Western civilization because it's not Eastern civilization, because it's not it's not another civilization, it's Western civilization. So, what it comes down to is at what point can we, or could we, or should we, or is it legitimate to say, I, we, you, him, me, prefer this civilization as opposed to that civilization? Can we have that conversation? Is that a legitimate conversation to be had? Now, again, that may be a rhetorical question, but that's the issue. So I don't want to, so it's not a question of your civilization is wrong, my civilization is right. Okay, your civilization is what it is, no problem. But that doesn't necessarily mean that
at some point, though, the question becomes who gets to decide, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah, yeah. So if
and how do we determine who gets to decide? And do we allow a very small group, a very vocal group? So, for example, right now there have been demonstrations at Columbia University, and they're ongoing. And the president said that action would be taken, and then action was not taken in the way that it was said it would be taken to resolve the problem, the crisis. So a very small group of people was allowed to take control of situations that affected very, very large groups of people. And this was done, it wasn't necessarily condoned, but in all practical terms, it was condoned because nothing was done to stop it.
Can I give you a jail story?
Yeah.
Okay, so in jail, so the reality of jail is you have the guards or you have the life of jail, but then there's guys that you live with in your pod, if you like, and there's usually about 30 of us, right? And there's always going to be 4 or 5 guys who are willing to fight and poke your eyes out and possibly get their eyes poked out because they want to take your piece of cake, or they want to put the TV on the channel that they want it to be on. Now, perhaps that person is looking at 20 years of jail time, or 25. Or maybe he's just been convicted to 25 years in jail. So he's still sitting beside you at the TV clicker station, or he's sitting at your table. Now, you might be looking at getting bailed in 2 weeks, or maybe you have another 10 days to go before you're released. He's willing to fight and die for your little piece of cake that he's just going to grab off your tray. The question then becomes, are you willing to defend that piece of cake, right, knowing that in 2 weeks you're out of here?
Right.
So he who is willing to kill and die and fight for whatever it is that he wants.
That's a very powerful, very good analogy. It reminds me of something somebody told me many, many years ago. Never get into a fight with anyone who has less to lose than you do.
Bingo. Exactly. And so to some extent, are there people now living among us? Are there conversation? I don't know. You tell me. Who they don't care if they get caught. They don't care if their face is
Well, this
plastered.
gets back to the highest honor being to be a martyr for Allah,
Well, no,
for example.
I'm not talking about that. I'm saying
No,
if
but that's one example, right? The motivation is like there's no higher honor than to receive that that
so.
commendation, that privilege, or whatever.
So the man who cut off the head off of, I'm not sure if it's the son or the grandson of Vincent van Gogh is Theo van Gogh, or is it the other way around? He was beheaded in the streets of Amsterdam because he made that film with Ayana Hirsi Ali called Obsession or Submission. The man who shot him in broad daylight, boom, boom, twice, and then pretty much decapitated him while he was probably dead, sat there. He didn't run away. He didn't try to escape. He was proud of what he had done. Because as far as he and the Muslim community at large in Holland or Netherlands at that time, to a lot of people, he was a hero.
Yep.
So
I'm reminded of that song by Ike and Tina Turner, right? Or Tina Turner, "We Don't Need Another Hero." Or here's a little bit of comic relief. Oops, that's not the one I wanted. Sorry, the chat's moving and I clicked on the wrong one. No, here we go. It's I guess it depends on what kind of cake it is as to whether you're going to fight for it.
well, if you got 2 weeks left to live, I mean, in the
It's
jail,
got to be a pretty good cake.
He might just say, "I'm not worth it. Take it. I'm out in 2 weeks anyway."
Yeah.
But so, again, when we talk about the law affects the lowest common denominator. But I don't think we want to live by the lowest common denominator. We would prefer to live with culture, an elevated culture, whatever that. So if a 12-year-old girl or a 17-year-old girl is nicely dressed and she looks good and she's going to her prom, many people would celebrate that and say that's a wonderful thing. Or if, but there are other cultures who would look at that and say that that's satanic, that's very haram. I can see her elbows and she's going to be mixing with boys and girls. So boys and girls meeting in a church basement at a Sunday dance or a Friday evening dance, as wholesome as it can be at times, if there's, it could be just like a square dance in a barn with your mother and father and grandparents all, the whole Tao dancing, swing do-si-dos and everyone goes in a circle. Some cultures would look upon that as perverted. Is it perverted? Is it not perverted? That's not the point. The point is there are people who look upon that as a perversion.
Yep.
So at what point does that culture start to become a very dominant influence in the culture? And I come back to, so for example, if we take a little bit of this, if I have some orange juice, like 2 liters of orange juice, and I add a little bit of apple juice to the orange juice, it might make it a more interesting orange juice. But if I keep adding apple juice at 10%, 20%, 30%, at some point it becomes just a mucky up flavor, perhaps. So how many flavors can we mix together before we get mud? The same with paint or with colors. At some point, you stop mixing.
I'll have to ask my kids because they do this thing called suicide when you go out to a restaurant and you take your cup and you take every single soft drink.
Yeah, well, at some point it becomes.
But then they learn at some point that, oh no, I don't want the lemonade in there. But Eric, this has been fascinating, and I know we're going to have to continue this discussion. We're actually over time, which we frequently do. We frequently do that, though I keep trying to not do it. I wanted to share a quote from the Baha'i Faith. This is something called the first hidden word of Baha'u'llah. I actually put it in the chat. The first hidden word, these are, in a way, they're a little bit like the Proverbs. They're really short and to the point, but they have more weight in the Baha'i Faith than the Proverbs because they are intended to be not just gems of practical wisdom, but potent statements of spiritual wisdom that distill the essence of the entire religion into a quote or two. So I think this is just something I wanted to share in the context of this discussion around who gets to decide, how do we decide, what governs, what is extremism, what is not extremism. And this is just an interesting quote in that regard. "O son of spirit, my first counsel is this: possess a pure, kindly, and radiant heart, that thine may be a sovereignty, ancient, imperishable, and everlasting." And this speaks to the ability of the individual to transcend, regardless of who's deciding, what they're deciding, what the culture is. And sovereignty can be attained by possessing a pure, kindly, and radiant heart. And of course, one has to possess it, defend it, cultivate it in order to achieve that. What's your take on a quote like that in this context?
My take on that quote is it's very apt. There's a lot we can learn from that. We can learn a lot from that quote, and it's something that we should ponder. Like, like when you when you ring a bell and you let the vibrations just ding. So to some extent, we can just ding and meditate upon that wisdom.
Thank you. And I thought that might be useful in sort of recapping this, because I find this fascinating, and I so appreciate your perspective on this, the dedication you've given to looking into this topic and presenting what is with fairness as you tack into the wind and evaluate and determine, and also how then to help others sort of unpack, what does this mean? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for what I believe or have professed to believe or have been taught to believe? And why do I believe it? And is it right? And is it, because really the question isn't, do I think it's extreme that you're doing something, or do you think it's extreme that I'm doing something? I should ask my question, is what I'm doing extreme, right? Is what I'm doing helpful? Is what I'm doing and defining really helpful and contributing to society? And another statement I've made so often is that religion should inspire, never coerce.
Well, that's correct from your perspective. Again, what some people will say, if I saw you running into a burning building, should I do everything I can to stop you from running into that burning building?
Right. Of course, I don't think the building is burning.
Well, but that's the point. Exactly.
Right. I think it's burning outside and the building is cool water.
Again, so everything that just comes down to, what do you, your perspective, my perspective, you say potato, I say potato.
Except that the differences are more severe, right?
Well,
that's
of
the
course.
point.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, we have to live with those very severe differences.
Yeah.
Yes. And so the question then becomes, what will we as a society, me and you and us, what are we prepared to do? Or even, are we prepared to actually explore and learn and face those realities?
Yep.
So I saw a comment, somebody said, we cannot live by law alone. Correct.
Yeah, let me go ahead and share that one. Here's another one that was shared, which is when you were talking about it's not Sharia law, it's just Sharia. There it is. It's also Mr. Cabbage, Lord Cole. Yes, indeed. I saw also you reacted to the fact that it does indeed mean cabbage, kohlrabi, kimchi. We cannot live by law alone. So is there somebody in particular that you'd like to offer a book to tonight?
Well, I would like your help in finding this, but perhaps Mr. Cabbage, as you say.
I'm more than happy to offer him a copy of your book. And he happens to be the gentleman who lives in Canada. So okay. That was not prompted. Or here's another one. I just love this comment. Whether this guy gets a book or not, and I'm not saying he should, I love the comment. I guess it depends on what kind of cake it is because it's a little bit humorous. And then Mr. Cabbage came in and said, rather to fight your desire for the cake, right? I also liked Michael's comment here. Geez, Wade, when I was talking about me being a pyromaniac running around with a bottle full of turpentine and setting a field on fire. I got to say, I did not set the field on fire intentionally.
But I'd like to come back to the cake thing. And I
Mhm.
think we shouldn't just dismiss that, because at some point, as a man, right, which I've been in that situation where,
You're talking about this comment. Depends on what kind of cake it is.
right, because then the
Right.
joke is that he's making, but he's not making a joke, is that as a man, sometimes you're thinking to yourself, okay, do I accept it?
Right.
How does this accept morally, my dignity?
No, you're absolutely right.
So
You're absolutely right.
our ego comes into it, and then you want to stand up, and you might want to fight, and then if you fight him, now you're going to fight 3 people, and now I've got 3 weeks to live there, so maybe I just need to submit. And for us as men to submit, sometimes it's not so easy, is it?
Well, no, and I appreciate your perspective, especially as one who took action and ended up in jail, right? It's no laughing matter. I took this in a humorous way, but now I see it the way you saw it, which is this isn't funny at all. It really does depend on what type of cake it is as to whether one decides at that moment to stand one's ground. Because you know the old saying, and I love this saying, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything.
Nothing. You'll fall for nothing, yeah, or fall for
Right.
anything, yeah. So I took a stand. I went to jail, but when I was in jail, there were times when I was in situations where I let the piece of cake go.
Right. Yeah. This piece of cake isn't worth it.
Right. And not literally, but figuratively. There were other situations
Of
where
course.
I had to just.
Of course. Yep. Well, so Lord Cole and Tempter Smasher, should we?
I think so. I think we can
All right.
do the two. So if you can get their addresses or something,
Yes.
I'll get the book off to them.
Yep. info@soupllc.com is where Lord, and I think we might have Lord Cole's address, but I can't remember if he gave it to us. Anyway, just to make sure that the process works, send an email to info@soupllc.com. And that's for Tempter Smasher and Lord Cole to claim your book. And I'll put that also on the video here. 1 second. And there's but one remaining task for me to do. Well, 2 actually, because you get to have the last word. But right before we go to the last word, I want to tell everybody who they will have the opportunity of hearing from when they show up next week, same time, same place, 8 p.m. Central Time for the Creating the Image of God show. Next week, we will have Valton Brown. Valton Brown hails from the UK. He's written a book called The Hidden Tree. And he asked the question, has the technological revolution and other global transitions successfully moved us towards a better future? ? But he's not just a futurist who's asking this question. Valton has a deep background in religion and has had a number of transcendence experiences on several continents through which he views this question. There's some parallel experiences. He wasn't a pyromaniac, using flamethrowers, but there are other parallel experiences that he and I had that made him somebody that I really wanted to bring on the show. You're not going to want to miss Valton Brown next week, 8 p.m. for the Created in the Image of God show, Tuesday, May 7th. So final words, final thoughts, deep thoughts, Mr. Brazau, for the audience. And I know you also said we'd love to maybe have some of these people come and join a panel for a future discussion or something like that. So we might have other ways in which to explore this topic further. But what are your final thoughts here to wrap up the evening?
When Islam says it wants to set up a caliphate in Germany, as they're doing right now, there's like thousands and screaming in the streets that we will set up a caliphate. This is not hyperbole. They're screaming that right now, yesterday. They do this not because they're bad people. They do this because from their perspective, this is the will of Allah. So they're not extremists. They're just Muslims who identify as true Muslims. And we must respect that they are Muslims and stop calling them extremists.
But then I guess we also need to decide what kind of society we want.
That's another question. That's another issue. But
Yep.
it's not for anyone to misidentify a person. So when someone does something, that goes kaboom in a bus or a concert, the media and many people quickly rush, as we have here in Toronto, I should say in Canada, we have what's called Motion M103. It's the Islamophobia motion.
Right.
And it specifically says in the motion, anyone who commits terrorism in the name of Islam is by definition cannot be a Muslim.
Interesting.
But if someone says that he is a Muslim, then how can we then take away his identity?
Well, this is very interesting, and I've got to throw one little comment in here, and that is very interesting when so it's one thing to say this person is excommunicated, right? And we denounce and disclaim that person. That might be legitimate. However, you have majority Muslim states who do the opposite for that person, who hail that person as a hero, in some cases even provide them with a pension.
Right, but yes, you may be, that's correct. But even if nobody did, if a man says that he now identifies as a 6-year-old little girl, we've had that case here in Canada. Well, on some level, we have to say he's a 6-year-old little girl.
Yeah, but I hear you, and I appreciate that. I would personally not go along with that argument.
I'm not saying you do or I do, but technically under human rights, we must.
And that's the thing that kind of brings it all back home to this point of hypocrisy, right? You either do or don't believe that the person has a right to self-declare their identity, and no one else has a right to challenge it. You either believe that or you don't.
Well, whether I believe it or I don't, right now, that's the way it's supposed to be.
Well, in Canada, again, anyway. In Canada, I'm just saying that that's being hotly debated in the United States, and that decision has not been definitively made. There are a number of challenges going on around various ways in the United States.
But the same people who will take away a Muslim man's identity because they say he did something not nice are the same. Also, there can be the same people who will say, if a man wants to identify as a woman, he must be able to identify as a woman. But they will take away a Muslim man's identity.
Right.
That's
I hear you, and I'm commenting on exactly that. I understand your position, and that's the other thing about when I tried to explain in my book, The People of the Sign, why I believed what I believed. I attempted to explain that it was coherent. There was a coherence. There was an integrity to my beliefs. Mm-hmm. Now, somebody else would say that's ridiculous. That shows the absolute complete lack of integrity. And my response would be, you don't understand the meaning of the word integrity. I'm saying these beliefs held together. They were coherent.
Correct.
They had integrity. They had integrity. A thief, honor among thieves, right?
Yeah, that's exactly.
Right. So, but the interesting thing is, in my trilogy, I used quotes from a Canadian artist, Leonard Cohen, to open each book. The song anthem, and the chorus of the song anthem is, "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in."
Right.
It's in those cracks where we realize our beliefs do not have integrity, right? They are not coherent. They are not consistent. They are hypocritical. We are deploying double standards and false equivalencies. We are viewing two things that are different as though they're the same. We're viewing two things that are the same as though they're different. That's where the light can get in and inform us that there might be something wrong in our own understanding of why we believe what we believe. And that's
But
for
wait.
each person to explore.
But wait, most people's beliefs, opinions, assertions, which is even better,
I like that.
Are never actually challenged, and so
Right.
they're never argued.
Right.
So because they're never argued and never challenged, the person can go for the next 20 years. For example, there's a lot of people who vote for whichever party they vote for only because that's the party they vote for. Simple as that.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Eric. This has
Hey,
truly
you're
been
most welcome.
enlightening.
Yes,
And
thank you.
I look forward to seeing you again on the show, and to the audience. Until next week, may God be with you.
Okay, and I'm looking forward to those addresses to send the books.